Okay, so right now we're going to talk about cell death. Now, remember we said that when you put a stress on the cell either adapts to that stress or it becomes injured. And we talked about reversible cellular injuries and irreversible cellular injury. Now, the cell death is basically that irreversible cellular injury. Now, before we get into the morphological characteristics of cell death, you should know that there are two main mechanisms by which cells die. Now, the first mechanism is necrosis, which is basically accidental cell death, unwanted cell death. And the second being apoptosis. And apoptosis means basically cellular suicide. The difference is that necrosis is always pathological. However, apoptosis is mostly physiological. It happens within the body all the time. Now, let's get into the hallmark. Now, the hallmark of cell death, the main characteristic of cell death, is the loss of the nucleus. Now, there are three steps by which the nuclei get lost. The first is called nuclear pycnosis. Now, basically, this is when the nuclei they become condensed and basically they resemble little ink dots within the histological appearance. The second is called karyorrhexis. Now, karyorrhexis means the fragmentation of the nucleus. And the third and final being karyolysis, and it means the dissolution of the nucleus. And the cell becomes anucleated. Now, when we talk about necrosis, necrosis has a couple of types. They are really high yield, really important to understand and know. The difference between each type now, coagulative necrosis, liquefactive necrosis, and etc., etc. So we are going to talk about each one of them in details. Now, the first, we're going to talk about coagulative necrosis. Now, coagulative necrosis basically happens when a tissue becomes ischemic. Okay, so there is an infarction or an ischemia into that tissue, and lack of blood flow, and the tissue becomes infarcted. However, not all tissues get coagulative necrosis. The brain, for example, does not get coagulative necrosis. Even if there was an ischemia, it gets liquefactive necrosis, which we will talk about in a minute. Now, suppose that this is an ischemia, and this is, as we know, this is a pale infarct, okay? In the gross appearance, this is a pale, wedge-shaped infarct. Now, basically, when we say coagulative, we mean that all the proteins, the tissue dies, and the proteins, they become coagulated, and however, the structure becomes the same. Stays the same. So the structure is the same between the normal tissue and the infarcted tissue. However, we see right here that there are no nuclei. The tissue is entirely dead. There are no nuclei, but the shape remains the same. Now, an important thing is that we should know why is it wedge-shaped, for example, in the kidney, and what does that mean? Now, basically, it is wedge-shaped because of the artery. So let's say that this tissue right here, this is an artery coming, a vessel, and it basically branches and supplies right here and right here. Okay, So suppose that there is an infarct in this area. This means that all this becomes infarcted tissue and it becomes pale. And the interesting thing is that the wedge shape basically points to the site of occlusion. Okay? And so this is a coagulative necrosis. Now, another important thing is that we should differentiate between pale necrosis and something that is called a pale infarct, and something that is called a red infarct. Now, a red infarct, such as this infarction right here, of course this is a testicle that has undergone a red infarction, okay, or a hemorrhagic infarction. Now, remember something. This is an artery, and this is an organ, and this is a vein. So the blood comes from the artery, through the organ, and out from the vein. Now, suppose that we have an obstruction right here, or an embolus, or whatever. This means that the blood can't go out, and it will re-enter that organ. Now, that organ, when it is a loose organ, such as the testicle, or the lung, or a liver, for example. Now, when it re-enters, it causes this kind of infarct. It causes, of course, ischemia due to venous obstruction, and then it causes this hemorrhagic infarct. And I have another picture regarding the lung, and this is a pulmonary infarction due to a thromboembolus in the lung. We can see all that red area, the red infarcted tissue, because the blood re-enters that loosely organized tissue. Okay? And this is basically coagulative necrosis. A high yield point is that the tissue remains firm, okay? However, it is dead, but it remains firm, and it is a result of an infarction, an ischemic obstruction to all tissues except for the brain, because the brain gets liquefactive or undergoes liquefactive necrosis, which we will talk about in the next video.